It is a conversion of gratitude into a right. How does this work? Gasset, I'd say Gasset in his genius recognizes the following, right? The masked man now stands alone. The masked man stands alone. And he, being a product of the 19th century, is the starting point, if you will, of all further existences. To be Aristotelian, for those of you who might be philosophy buffs, this won't make sense to most people, and I'm not going to go in and explain it. But for those of you who watch my videos, and many of you do, and you're pretty astute with philosophy, you can think of the masked man for Gasset as being synonymous with Aristotle's uncaused cause, right? The masked man is uncaused, but he is the cause of, right? So it's the uncaused cause, which was otherwise relegated to the position of God. Only God had that power. Nothing caused God, so the 5-year-old asks you, what causes God? You say, well, nothing caused God, right? If you believe in God. Nothing caused God. God's always been around in the universe, but he's the cause of everything else. Similarly, nothing really caused the masked man, but the masked man is the cause of. But I'm not going to get into that. What I do need is this arrow, however. Right? What happened before his time? Well, before the era of the masked man, so to be specific, from the 19th century back to the beginning of time, you had notions of humility, and what was the word that he used? Gratitude. You had notions of humility and gratitude, right? What the masked man has done is he's barricaded, he's separated. He's not even allowing it to influence him. That's why it's uncaused, right? He's not allowing humility and gratitude to influence him specifically. Rather, he sees himself as the starting point, one. And all that lies ahead of him, up until the infinite, is a direct result of him. So he begins this succession. All that follows after him at any point, at any time on the timeline, up until the point of infinity, is traceable back to all the way to the masked man. So that he is directly responsible for the totality of history. His arrival is a direct result of the totality of history. This is the notion of the masked man, according to Gasset. Now, he has converted this idea. The masked man, according to Gasset, has converted this notion of gratitude into the notion of rights, right? The hardest time I have with Gasset, not in understanding per se, but in trying to recognize the significance that he places on this, and we'll have to wait and see where he goes in the analysis, and I think it's a fair question, is to ask whether or not Gasset was in support of rights. Up until now, we haven't gone through the whole book, but up until now, the question might be answered by saying, well, it doesn't seem that he's in support of rights. We'll have to wait to see if that's true. If, at the conclusion of this, we recognize that Gasset is not in support of rights, then I might have problems with Gasset. If we recognize at the conclusion of this that Gasset is in support of modifying how we define rights, then I'm totally in support of that. Right? But what I think it's important to recognize, whether or not he is or is not in support of rights is neither here nor there. So that people up until this point in chapter 6 will read Gasset and they'll start to think to themselves, oh, this guy isn't in support of rights, I'm not going to read him, you know, he's going to, I mean, that idea of disbarring the idea of, or discrediting the idea of rights is what leads to totalitarianism, fascism, and so on. I wouldn't go that far, and I would actually say that that's a misread of of Gasset. What Gasset is talking about isn't so much rights directly as it is the notion of the masked man. So what I can say definitively at this point then is that Gasset is more concerned in chapter 6 with the masked man and a discussion of what the masked man is, who this person is, how we can understand him, than he's concerned with rights. The only thing that he's saying with respect to rights is that the masked man recognizes the power of talking about rights rather than looking at history as being gracious, right? And what does this mean? Well, you would think in a previous era, and he cites, I think, the 17th or maybe 18th century, that in a feudal system, you have those who have not. Those who have not have accepted their plight in life. Life is hard, life is challenging. I might work the field, I might hunt animals. And if for whatever reason I'm blessed with an ability to get a larger portion of land or a better circumstance in life, I'm grateful for that. What happens in this era now is that I'm no longer interested in what I can be handed. It is more an expectation of, if there is a product, if there is an ability for me to expand my personal significance, my personal wealth, my personal familial ties, then I have a right to do so. Don't talk to me anymore about being humble and being gracious. Don't talk to me anymore about waiting and being patient. I want it now, I want it immediately, and I have a right to have it. That's the change, right? So for Gasset, and it's far more complicated than that, but I don't have actually the time to get into the sort of semantics of it all. Chapter 6, to be honest with you, is letting the cat out the bag, is probably, if not my favorite chapter, my second favorite chapter in the whole book. I think it's an amazing chapter. And I think one of the key characteristics in understanding Gasset's analysis of the masked man is recognizing that for the masked man, according to the Gasset, the masked man has placed total emphasis on the notion of rights and not on this idea of gratitude and humility. Now, is it the case that the masked man is perverting the idea of rights for his own benefit or not is open to debate, right? I would take the argument that the masked man is willfully perverting the notion of rights to facilitate his rights over the rights of another, but that's another discussion. So, with respect to Gasset then, the third characteristic of the masked man is that the masked man has grown arrogant and enforces his rights over the rights of others. The fourth characteristic of the masked man in chapter 6 is the masked man is unobstructed and insatiable. The masked man is unobstructed and he's insatiable. And the question is, what is he unobstructed from, and what satisfies his insatiability? Okay, so let's read that section. All right. For the common man of all periods, life, in quotes, had principally meant limitations, obligations, dependence, and a world pressure. The world which surrounds the new man from his birth does not compel him to limit himself in any fashion. Does not compel him to limit himself in any fashion. It sets up no veto in opposition to him. On the contrary, it incites his appetites. It incites his appetite, which in principle can increase indefinitely. Now, the two things that we're discussing here is a notion of not being obstructed, not being contained, and this idea of his appetites being aroused, if you will, right? And what does he say? On the contrary, it incites his appetite. What is the it? The world which surrounds the new man from his birth does not compel him to limit in any fashion. It sets up no veto in opposition to him. On the contrary, it incites his appetite. What is it? The world, right? Because it begins the world.